Welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm so pleased to be joined by David Kajganich, the writer of Luca Guadagnino's Bones and All, a new film coming out in November. David, I was just briefly saying to you, I've been thinking about this movie since I saw it at Telluride. I was fortunate enough to go. And after that screening, I think you were up there on stage with some of the cast and Luca, and you talked about how when you were approached to adapt Camila De Angelis's book, you were excited, but then like maybe a little apprehension because you weren't sure if you were the right fit to adapt a movie or a book that was about a young woman and her coming of age. And then you spoke to Camille, and it kind of like you were felt comfortable going forward. And I guess I would love to hear you talk about like what that conversation was like and like what it was that made you think you would be the right person to do this adaptation.
Well, I think first I should say, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited that you're excited by the film, and Telluride was a heck of a great screening. The process I went through with Camille to start the project was, this obviously is in some sense a genre film, but in a completely different sense, this is a story of a young woman's sort of awakening into her identity. And I loved the book when I read it, and I certainly felt my own personal connection to the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean ever that you're the right person to write it. And I think that's a healthy question to ask at the beginning of any serious project is am I the person that's the best to sort of be the steward of this adaptation? Because I think if you're doing it right, it's less an adaptation and more a translation to a different medium. I mean, this is a visual medium. And although we did make changes to the book and some fairly deep changes, I think the soul of the book is still there, and luckily Camille agrees. But at the very beginning, I think I wanted permission is the wrong word, but and encouragement is the wrong word, because those sort of one suggests something too passive and the latter suggests something too active. But I just wanted her to feel how I was connecting to the book, kind of as a tangential subject, and more talk about how she was connecting to the book and what it meant to her to have written it, have it out in the world, what it meant to her to have a film adaptation be on the table, what she was really hopeful would be retained, if there was anything in the book that she felt she hadn't articulated strongly enough. I wanted to listen more than talk. So it was less me pitching my take to her and more my asking a lot of questions of her so that I felt like I understood the book from her point of view as much as is possible.
Right.
And it went, those conversations were really lovely. And I think her empathy for her character shone through, and my empathy for her book shone through. And we launched it that way, and it was really helpful to do it that way.
Yeah, it's great. You mentioned there in that answer a little about how it's like it almost does defy genre, right? It's like a coming of age movie, it's a romance, it's a road trip movie, it's an 80s, like I don't want to say satire, but at least like a thoughtful like look at the 80s, I think. And obviously the horror component and and about identity, all these different things that you're juggling in this script and with the core relationship as well. As a screenwriter, how do you like keep all of that? How do you keep all those balls in the air and not like drop them? I guess I just found it fascinating watching the movie. It is so, I feel like it is so disciplined in all those genres and just really works. I guess I'm sure it starts on the page. So how did you do that? Basically.
Well, sure. I mean, the closest analogy I can think of is when I watched like high platform divers, and I think how do they how do they get through all of those moves and hit the water sort of safely, let alone elegantly, and I think, with a project that has this kind of tone that just vacillates so hard sometimes scene to scene or even within a scene between different genres, it's, first of all, I can make a blueprint for it, but one thing that's really lovely about working with Luca is that he has me at his elbow for the production as well. And so that allows us to make tiny changes and nuanced changes scene to scene to scene. We're in constant conversation with the actors. They're always encouraged to give feedback, even to the most minute level, on their characters. And so it's a kind of a constant process of adjustment, which I love. And I know that's not an experience that a lot of screenwriters get to have, to be, to really be trusted in their work at the beginning of the process, but also invited to collaborate in the work during production and also in the editing room. So there are 3 chances to revise sort of as we go. And with Luca, that's possible because we have a lot of trust between us, and a lot of respect for one another's processes. And a screenwriter, part of my job when I work with a director like Luca is to try to adapt as much as possible to his process, and not be finicky or too to not to fetishize my own process somehow. And so it happens organically across many moments, how these tiny adjustments get made. But certainly when it was just me at my computer writing this first draft, knowing that I had the author's support, and knowing that I was unafraid of the visual components that a movie adaptation of this book would require. And so I just went as far up to the line I thought I could go before it tipped into something that was too within one genre at the expense of others, and just tried to find the sweet spot between all 3 or 4 of them.
That's great. And I wanted to ask you about that too, obviously. And you worked with Luca previously on Bigger Splash, I believe, right? And Suspiria. So you have a great relationship with him. When you're writing it, and I know he came on, I think he was not the original director, or at least, right? And then he came on after. So when you were writing that, and specifically, I guess I wanted to ask you this. I'll be honest, I was nervous coming in because obviously it's about cannibals. I was like, and I'm not the biggest gore person. So I was like, am I going to be able to watch this? And then I was pleasantly surprised that while it is definitely a movie about cannibals and they're eating other people, it is not exploitative. It's not like what I was expecting at all. And I guess I wanted to talk to you about writing those scenes and working with Luca, I guess, and how your relationship on those previous films, especially Suspiria, because I feel like it's maybe kind of in the same, a little bit of the same, where it's not exploitative in the violence, I guess. How did you guys work on that? And where do you go up on the line? How far do you go to that line?
Well, I think, you use the word exploitative, and it makes me sort of want to unpack what that word really means. And I think if you're in a story like this, where it's not exclusively a horror film, and, so we do have time. I have time in the script. The actors have time in front of the camera. Luca has time behind the camera to unpack a lot of moments that have to do with character building that I think a straight genre film wouldn't have time for, or the inclination to explore. And so to me, when those character moments are there and you're building a psychological and an emotional and a spiritual world for the characters that can be communicated to the audience, there's nothing left to exploit. You have dignified the characters before you apply the filter of genre. And I think, that's the trick to me. If somebody had come in, if MGM or Luca or whomever had come in and said, we need to take an additional 25 minutes out of this film, it wouldn't have survived, because I know what would have been cut. It would have been the quiet, nuanced character moments that don't in a traditional way drive the plot forward. And without those, then yes, we would be exploiting those characters because they would have been underwritten.
That's amazing. And that's a great answer. And actually was another thing I wanted to ask you about is watching this. I'm just, like I said, I've been thinking about it so much. And part of the reason is the characters, not just Marin, who is played by Taylor Russell, who's incredible, and Lee, played by Timothee Chalamet. They're the main romantic couple, but you have all these wonderful supporting characters in very small moments where it's Michael Stuhlbarg is playing somebody in a scene with David Gordon Green. And then obviously Mark Rylance is Sully, comes through, peppered through the script. And you have Chloe Sevigny for one scene and Andre Holland for 2 scenes, and all of these great actors and all these great characters. And I was recently watching True Romance, again, Tony Scott and Quentin Tarantino movie. And one of the things when I was watching, I was like, man, every one of these characters is a home run. And even when they're in it for 5 seconds, I'm like, I'd love to see what they're doing the rest of the movie. And I felt like that with this movie as well, where you were just I would love to see a movie about Chloe Sevigny. You know what I mean? You've created these rich characters who make such an immediate impact with no minimal screen time, basically. And I just found that fascinating. And obviously, I'm sure you're working with the book and stuff, and you have these great actors. But I mean, can you talk about being able to write characters like that when they're just going to be in there for a scene or two? I just found that incredible.
Sure. Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, to me, that's the hallmark of sort of good work in the collaboration, is that you feel the lives of these characters outside of the margins of the scenes they're in. And I guess that starts with a screenwriter who's willing to write more than is going to be in the film, or at least think past the margins of the scenes they're in. I mean, I hate the idea of deploying characters in a plot. To me, that's the wrong way to go about it. And so, when I was thinking about, Jake and Brad, the characters that Michael Stuhlbarg and David Gordon Green play, they're not in the book. They're something I added to articulate sort of a different kind of thematic vector into the subjects of the film. And, once I knew it was going to be Michael and David playing those parts, there's obviously great reassurance that they're going to be fascinating to watch. But, Michael and I had like a really long conversation about, it must have been 200 questions he had about that character. And I had answers because I had thought past how the character was deployed in the film. He was thinking past how the character was deployed in the film. And, sometimes those conversations can be ridiculed, when you're talking about, like, what did my character have for breakfast and things like that. But that's not what I mean. Like, Michael was really trying to get at the center of how that man lived, the logistics of his life, where he found his sort of spiritual comfort, like really fascinating questions. And I think, as surprised as I was that he had so many of them, he was surprised I had answers. And I think it's that. I mean, I spent, I don't know, you have to be willing to spend your sort of evenings after you close your laptop still thinking about these people as people and wondering, how does somebody like Jake live? Like, where does he get his money to subsist? Where does he live when he's not on the road? How did he meet, like all of these questions, and some end up being shaded into the dialogue, but a lot of it doesn't. But I still want to do it, and it's certainly valuable to do it. And so it becomes almost a literary method as opposed to a technical method, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's an interesting, the other thing I'll mention another movie that I thought of, because you have the movie here where there's like this, it's an incredible world you've built. Like, it's like treating cannibals as like something that exists, and they have all these, like, they could smell each, you know what I mean? These like very specific rules, I guess, about the world, for lack of a better word. And you've done all this world building, and I found it incredible without a lot of like really dull exposition. But I felt like I found, like, this is another movie I reminded me of it. I thinking back on it, I was like, the original Star Wars, before it became like a massive franchise, the scene where like Obi-Wan and Luke are talking, and Obi-Wan talks about the Clone Wars. It's like one line, and it has really spawned dozens of Star Wars movies, right? But it's like so cool. And I remember when I was a kid watching it, being like, oh man, that's so cool. I'd love to know, like, just that one thing. It has so much history. And I feel like you have a lot of that here in this movie, with like just how you are, it's very easy for the audience to understand the world, but you're not killing it with like over-explained exposition that is common for franchise movies, I guess. And I just was like really fascinated by that too, as you're writing it, because I think you do such a great job of making it clear what's going on, and that this is a world that exists, without like hammering that home, I guess. I don't know.
Well, that means a lot to me, because that is something I care a lot about, is not mistreating the audience by explaining things to them that I'm sure that they can intuit. Do you know what I mean? Or most people in the audience can intuit. And to me, it's very simple, which is, if there is a character who is motivated to talk about the rules or express them in some way, that's fine. That's great, because we're seeing character be developed. If it's a line of exposition for the audience, I will fight tooth and nail to not include it in the film. And sometimes you have to include a couple of lines like that in a script, so that, a script is also a kind of sales document, right? And to get people's buy-in, they need the reassurance sometimes of a stricter set of rules by a little bit. But Luca knows that I hate that. I know he hates it. So, we can take those things out before we shoot. We can take those things out in the editing room. And it's amazing how quickly Luca can point to a line and say, "You don't love this line, do you?" I'm like, "No, I hate it. I'm hoping we'll take it out." And he said, "Agreed, let's take that out as soon as possible." And it just becomes a process of two people who have the same sense of an audience's IQ, and not wanting to compromise that with things like exposition.
I love that. And I know we have to wrap up here, but I was reading, I think I read an interview you did with the Iowa Source, and you talked about getting to see it with an audience off the street, basically like a real audience, right? Not like a festival audience or all these things, and how you wanted to see how it played. And I was thinking of that quote, or that comment you made. There was a recent article, I think in IndieWire or something, talking about like the Oscars need to be cool, and like talking about like the blockbuster movies that could get nominated, so like Top Gun and all these different things. But I was like, I don't know. I feel like this movie is a perfect example, because I feel like the artistry is so high, and like the crafts across the board, and like we're talking about your script, it's so thoughtful, performances are great, but it is like a movie for audiences, and I think it really respects the audiences. I'm not asking you to like comment on the awards of it all or whatever, but I guess, can you just like, why is this kind of, like, in your estimation, I guess, like, why is it increasingly rare to have that marriage of like art but like audience as well? Because I think this movie does it really well. I don't think it's like a movie that I think like 14-year-old, like teenagers are going to see this movie and really love it. You know what I mean? More so than they would maybe like an arty movie that is great. I'm not knocking, I love all those movies, but I was wondering like your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's true. It's certainly, we wrote it hoping that what it became was a kind of empathy magnet in spite of its, in spite of some of its subject matter. And, I think to my mind, there's a kind of feedback loop that goes on between sort of, I don't know, audiences and critics, that tends to we read so many reviews that are summaries as opposed to reviews, you know what I mean? And we have so many platforms now for audiences to react to things in very, let's call them literal ways. And so I think sometimes, the initial conversations about a film can sort of can really reduce them conceptually. So if you have a film like this that does have a pretty, it's a fairly simple concept to articulate, genre concept in the middle of this film. If that's all that gets articulated, then I think it really just, discourages people to explore it because they don't think there's much beyond that concept. And that's the danger of having a film that is somewhat of a genre film, but not entirely, because it risks not pleasing the people that are coming for the genre experience, and it risks alienating people who aren't interested in the genre experience at all. But the collaborators, that's why it's so important to have collaborators like we had on this film. I think, wanting to see Timothee in the middle of a film like this, or wanting to see sort of Taylor or Michael Stuhlbarg or any of the actors, Chloe, in a film like this, you think, well, there must be something to this for them all to have agreed. So maybe that the sort of the casting and the way that Luca became a part of the film, and maybe that is the thing that will help this film cross that line into more people's curiosity, because it clearly isn't just one thing or another. And it can't be reduced to that either because of all the people involved. So to me, that's a sort of, I do that myself when I think about what to go and see. I look to the collaborators more than the story anymore, because I'm so often surprised by being fascinated by things I didn't think I would be, because the collaborators were fascinated by it, if that makes sense.
David Kajganich, screenwriter for Bones and All. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to talk. Thank you for having me.